Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're in Game 11 of the 2018 World Chess Championships. There's 12 games total, so one game after this. We have 10 draws up until this point. If you've been following along, you know that it's been draw after draw after draw, but it comes down to these final two games. Magnus Carlsen playing the white pieces today. There will be a break tomorrow before game number 12. Generally, they've been playing 2 days back-to-back and then a rest day. These final two games, there is a rest day in between. So Fabiano, regardless of the result today, will have the white pieces in the final 12th game. But Magnus Carlsen, this is his last shot in the classical variation time control as the white pieces. Now, may have some options later on if they get to the tiebreaker, the blitz rapid portion of the tournament. But Magnus Carlsen, he had a day off. What does he come up with? And he starts with pawn to e4, pawn e5, knight to f3, knight to f6. If you're not super familiar with this opening, this is the Petrov defense. This is Fabiano's favorite defense by far. He's studied this more than anything else. Magnus Carlsen's only played this once so far in the tournament, and it was a head scratcher then, because why would you play against your opponent's favorite defense? But that's exactly what Magnus Carlsen decided as his final opening to play. Knight takes on e5. This is the main variation. Pawn d6. Definitely want to make sure you're always playing pawn to d6. If you're not familiar, you can watch the other video where Magnus Carlsen play this, or you can just watch my video on the Petrov defense. But then Magnus Carlsen comes back to knight to f3. Now, earlier in the tournament, he did play knight to d3. It was an odd move, but he ended up with a pretty good game, even with Fabiano being so well versed in the Petrov defense. This one, he goes back to more of the main line with knight to f3. Knight takes down here on e4, knight up to c3. These are all the common lines that everyone is familiar with. What's interesting is they played the first 10 moves in under 2 minutes. 2 total minutes for all of the first 10 moves from both players. And they went for the variation to castle on the queen side for Magnus Carlsen. So really it just becomes a race of who can attack their opponent's side faster. Fabiano did decide to deviate from the main line here on move number 9. Instead of immediately attacking on the queen side, he plays knight to f6. Some of his preparation that probably went into the tournament. If you have a favorite move, you probably spend more time on that than anything else. Just trying to figure out where you can find small little advantages. Magnus Carlsen didn't take long to play bishop to d3 and then pawn c5. So these are the 10 moves that took under 2 minutes. Both sides extremely prepared for the situation that we look at right here. The next move is the first move that Magnus Carlsen or any player took over 20 seconds. He took about 10 minutes on this next move. That's rook over here to e1, just centralizing his pieces in the center of the board. Bishop to e6, attacking this pawn right here. 2 ways to really defend this. Pawn to c4 is one of them. This is defended by the bishop here on d3, or could just play king over here to b1. And yes, you could play pawn to c4. You don't have to worry about your king coming over just yet to b1. It's still protected here on a2. If you were to see something like pawn to b5, even if you take here, the bishop can't come down to a2 because pawn to b3, this is going to block in the bishop. That bishop is going to fall. But we do see Magnus Carlsen not even wanting to worry about the pawn over here. Decides to play king to b1. Now queen to a5, and at this point decides, okay, I need to block this off. Both the bishop and the queen here are attacking the pawn. I need to go ahead and play pawn to c4. My opinion, this is exactly what Fabiano wanted to do, and he takes the queen down here on d2. From a fan's perspective, not necessarily what we want to see. 13 moves in, both sides have already gotten their queens off the board, but if you look at from Fabiano's perspective, the Petrov defense is already very drawish. He knows that this is Magnus Carlsen's last chance as white. If he can just defend correctly and get a draw, he's going to go in with the prep day for game 12 for everything that he's been working for his entire life. He has one game as white. If he wins, he will be the world champion, the second American-born player ever since Bobby Fischer. So that is what is at stake for him. So trading down queens makes a lot of sense. Pawn to h6 from Fabiano, just blocking off the g5 square here. And Magnus Carlsen plays an interesting move. I really just like pawn to h3. The knight coming down here to g4 seems like something I don't want to have to deal with if I'm Magnus Carlsen. He plays knight to h4. I really expected here just the knight to come down to g4, attacking both of these pawns right here. That's not what Magnus Carlsen was met with. Instead, we see rook to e8 from Fabiano. And then knight to g6. The pawn can't take here unless he wants to give up the bishop on e6. So recognizing that, yes, it can attack this bishop here on e7 freely because this pawn is now overloaded with what it's trying to do. Knight comes down here to g4 now. Bishop comes off the board. Rook takes, and then rook up here to e2. Now, this is a pseudo trap. There's a lot of these moves that you'll see at high level play. You do not want to take with the rook here, or excuse me, the knight here on h2, because f3 is going to eventually trap the knight. There's no way for the knight to escape. There's a couple ways that white can attack this bishop up here to f4. If you were to see something, pawn down to g5 to stop the bishop coming up here, you can just play the rook over to h1. So no real good option for black here. So he correctly, after the rook comes to e2 to protect the one pawn he needs to on f2, he brings his knight back here to e5. Magnus Carlsen does have the bishop pair. He wants to attack that. So after the bishop to f4, he decides to go ahead and take here on d3. Rook recaptures, and then rook to d7. Now, Magnus Carlsen has a couple options. He does have the pawn exposed here on c4, so he could play something to defend that. Instead, he has both the rook and the bishop here attacking the pawn here on d6. Decides to go ahead and take that, exchange down material, also giving up his pawn here on c4. He has a double pawn on the c file, so giving that up, probably not the worst thing for Magnus Carlsen. Bishop takes here on d6, rook to d8, rook defends it, and then the bishop takes here on c4. So you can see already 23 moves in, they've exchanged quite a bit of material on the board. King to c1, just centralizing this. It also opens up the door for the pawn here on a2. Fabiano does correctly decide, yeah, I'm not going to fall for that trap, and I'm going to play pawn to b6. Same thing as we looked at before. Bishop to a2 is going to be met by pawn to b3. That's just not something Fabiano wants to deal with. So instead, he says, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and solidify that pawn chain right here. Bishop comes back to b4, and this is a very important square. After the rook takes and the king takes here, then we see pawn to a6. Now, you'll see how different this is if instead of pawn to a6, the bishop takes here on a2. It's a little bit different than it was before. Pawn to b3. Now we have pawn to c4, and things start to get a little interesting here. King to c1, pawn takes, king up here to b2, but then after the pawn takes and the king takes the bishop, then the pawn can't come down to c1. The bishop is defending that correctly. So that's why that bishop there on f4 is extremely important. So in the game after king to d2, we see pawn to a6. In this position, I think everyone can look at and say that from a material standpoint, both sides are equal. 6 pawns, both have a bishop. Magnus Carlsen has a king that's a little more in the center, involved into the game. But both sides have opposite color bishops. Generally, what you're going to see in this type of endgame is white's going to look to put all of his pawns on the dark squares. Fabiano has a light square bishop, so you can just pretty much make that piece irrelevant. And Fabiano is going to try to do the opposite, put all of his pieces, material on the light square so that this dark square bishop cannot attack any of them. Right now, if you look at it, the king side's pretty much protected. All the pawns, this king is defending everything correctly. Fabiano just has to worry about these two pawns right here. Magnus Carlsen, first he has to deal with this pawn right here under attack. Let's go ahead and get that on a dark square. The best way for Fabiano to continue would be something like bishop to f1. This is attacking this pawn after the pawn moves to g3, getting a dark square. He could play pawn to b5, and then doesn't really matter where white goes. He could play pawn c4, getting him all on light squares. Doesn't have to worry about the bishop. Instead, he plays a really odd move to me. He plays king to f8. Not only is this not what you should be doing, but it also allows your opponent to just get a free pawn, because bishop to c7, pawn has to push forward, and then bishop to d6, checking the king. Why is the king here on f8? The king moves, and then bishop takes on c5. Now, still very difficult for Magnus Carlsen to turn this into a win, but Fabiano playing so flawless, getting into the endgame just to give up a pawn, seems odd to me. Pawn to h5, king e3, just centralizing, king to d7, king d4, pawn g6. You can see Fabiano already has all of his pawns on the light squares, exactly what we talked about. Pawn to g3, not even going to wait for Fabiano to bring his pawn down here, or bishop down here to f1. Just go ahead and push that pawn up to g3, getting it on the dark squares. Bishop down here to e2. Bishop f8, king to c6. And then we start to go through just a series of moves as both sides trying to find a weakness in their opponent's position. They want to get their kings heavily involved into the action. That's really the only option they have to attack some of these squares, since their bishops can't attack their opponent's pawns. They're on the opposite colors. But they went about 25 moves, exchanged all the material off the board just to come to the end game that you see here. Pawn to b3, bishop down here to d1, attacking the pawn. King comes back to d3 to defend that. Bishop g4 starts to push on the queen side. Immediately once the bishop goes to the king side, Magnus Carlsen says, I'll try to attack on the queen side. Pawn to c4, bishop comes up to attack, king protects it. Pawn c4, so Magnus Carlsen does have a passed pawn. It's going to be very difficult to push that, but bishop to g4, pawn up here to c5 on that dark square as we talked about. Bishop to e6, bishop over here to h6. Then we just come through. You can see both sides trying to find a small advantage, but very, very difficult. And then Magnus Carlsen says, yeah, I have a pawn advantage. So maybe I can exchange some material off the board and find a weakness in my opponent. Fabiano playing extremely well, just dancing back and forth, knowing that it's going to be very difficult for his opponent to do anything, making sure his king doesn't move from this square here on c6. He knows his bishop can't move it, and the king can never get close enough, so there's no way that that king is going to be forced to move that square. Then we have pawn to f5. Bishop comes down here to b1, and then a very interesting move. We have bishop down to f2. Now this is on move 55. If you look at it, seems odd. Magnus Carlsen allows his opponent to come down to b1 and almost freely take this pawn here on f5. It's protected by the pawn on g6. There's a lot of ways for him to protect the bat. Instead, he plays bishop to f2. He doesn't have to worry about defending the square here on h4, but this is the last and final attempt for Magnus Carlsen to lay a trap to get his opponent to make a mistake. Now, Fabiano did not fall for the trap. The trap would be bishop taking here on f5, because pawn to h5 is a killer. If you can kind of look at this and see, the pawn can't take because the bishop's going to fall. Magnus Carlsen's going to win this very, very easily. If instead you look at this and say, okay, the bishop is under attack, the pawn's going to come up here to h6 or just freely take here. One of those options, more than likely pawn up here to h6. Maybe the bishop comes back to c2, pawn to h6, pawn to g5. Needs to open up the door for the light square bishop to defend the h7 square. But then the king can just start gobbling up material. King to f6 to take this pawn. You can see if the king tries to come over here to the a3 pawn, he would really like to take this so he can have his own passed pawn, but this opens up the door. He can't move too far, or the c pawn is going to promote for Magnus Carlsen as well. If the bishop comes up here, sure, king to g7. Going to have to take the pawn. The bishop's going to fall. Magnus Carlsen will have a very good game from here as well. So instead, he does not fall for the trap. He plays bishop to c2. And at this point, both sides decide to go ahead and draw. Would have been terrible if Fabiano, after 11 games, ended up falling for that bishop to f5, but he had plenty of time to look at and see that, yeah, I'm not falling for that trap. So after 55 moves, they decide to draw. I'll be honest, as a spectator, I expected more from Magnus Carlsen. Playing this last game as white, going against your opponent playing the Petrov defense, I just don't understand why he decided to do that. Both sides, you could tell from the beginning, they just blitzed out of there. It was almost if they were preparing for the tiebreaker. They were going so fast. You know your opponent's prepared more than anything for this. You're not going to catch him off guard. I just don't know why he had to do that, unless he just feels very confident that he's going to get a draw on Monday with the black pieces, and then he can go into the blitz portion. But thought he might press a little bit more with the white pieces today. He did not. So we do have a day off tomorrow, as we said, and then we come back for Monday for Game 12. Fabiano, everything rides on this with the white pieces. Hopefully, guys enjoyed this game, game number 11, off tomorrow, and then I'll see you on Monday for game number 12, potentially the decisive game in the World Championship 2018. See you guys later. Bye.